In 1914, Ceylon recorded its first cases of the bubonic plague. The infection carried by rat fleas, which had devastated Europe 6 centuries previously, killed over 381 people. The outbreak began in Petar and, according to city records, was concentrated near the harbour and in areas with abject poverty. Over the next 5 years, 92% of the 1,709 people that contracted the plague in the country succumbed to the disease. However, this was not the first time a deadly outbreak of disease was recorded in colonial Ceylon. Before this outbreak, in the 1800s, the country had bouts of cholera which recorded over 10 deaths in a span of 9 years. Later, in 1918, Ceylon experienced a pandemic for the first time, the Spanish influenza, which killed 41,916 people during the 4 years it lasted. The situation was dire. The city of Colombo under the colonial rulers was increasingly becoming prone to disease, overcrowding and poverty, very much like their own cities in Europe. And they wanted a solution, a sustainable solution that would have been tested and proven in their cities. So they focused on city planning, specifically through efforts to develop Colombo as the Garden City of the East. Unfortunately, things did not go according to plan.
The Housing Ordinance of 1915 legalized the idea of overcrowding, and the authorities picked the definition from the British Municipal Council's Ordinance number 6 of 1910. According to the Ceylon Observer, which I consulted, over 50 persons per acre was considered overcrowding. As you can see, the density of Colombo is far greater today. In the larger discourse of planning, overcrowding was linked to disease and pathological city at that time. This relationship was derived from other places such as India and the UK, where there was plague.
This is Nihal Pereira, Professor of Urban Planning. He is an expert in studies relating to urban development and how people transform urban spaces to suit their lives. We spoke to Professor Pereira to better understand how Colombo under colonial rule sought to solve the issue of potential epidemics through city planning.
The most important thing that I learned was that Colombo, where I went to school and associated since my childhood, was actually an alien city that was imposed on people. In Brohier's words, Colombo is a city forced upon the people of Ceylon and not a creation of their own choice of making, which was something that I saw independently through my studies, and then I also saw it got corroborated with Brohier's idea that it's an imposition.
According to Professor Pereira, the mayor and the municipal commissioner intensely discussed overcrowding in the late 1910s, and there was a debate on poor neighborhoods. In the end, the British administrators invited Sir Patrick Geddes in 1921 to guide Colombo's development. Sir Geddes was a zoologist who later became famous as an imperial town planner, having travelled many parts of the British Empire, who saw qualities of a garden city already in Colombo, where the rural aspects of living was present in an urban space. The Garden City movement was a method of urban planning proposed in 1898 by Ebenezer Howard, who wanted to capture the primary benefits of countryside and urban environments while avoiding the disadvantages of both.
I argue in my book, Decolonizing Ceylon, that Cinnamon Gardens is a garden city. However, Garden City principle was not yet established. The Garden City became a principle in 1898, after Cinnamon Gardens was created. Evidently, the British already had the idea in their culture. This pretty much follows the British elite who in the UK who decided to live outside of the city, as opposed to the French who reclaimed the city from the poor through housemanization and getting the poor out of the city. So you can see it is the same British culture that you see in Cinnamon Gardens. So Geddes complimented colonial areas when he arrived. He said, "Oh, this is a garden city." It was pretty much a garden city. That's what Cinnamon Gardens was built as. It's not really a residential district, but a cultural district with a museum, cricket grounds, and much more. Geddes' plan actually displaced the original focus from overcrowding, which brought him into Colombo, overcrowding and the poor areas, especially the harbour area. which caused the municipality to invite him, and he started focusing on the center of the city.
This was the point where everything turned to the worst. While numerous plagues and epidemics struck Ceylon at the time and even later on, the impact of them was very minimal. And yet, the fear of poverty-stricken locals spreading disease was more or less reinforced through the housing ordinance. This is what Professor Pereira notes as Ceylon having imported problems, although there was no need for it.
This whole discourse of overcrowding and why Colombo needs planning, then bringing Giddies, and the importing of town planning discourse come as a consequence of the housing ordinance of 1915. The ordinance totally changed the way we see the city. The municipality began to exercise authority over the environment where the poor live. It not only condemned these environments and wanted to upgrade them, but also that is their right to intervene into the environments where the poor live. This is a whole different way of understanding and approaching the city as opposed to just providing infrastructure and so on.
The planning of cities that used to focus on building infrastructure like roads and water supply began, for the first time, to focus on the living environments of the poor. According to Professor Pereira, the British did not believe that it was simply the municipality's responsibility to improve the living conditions of the poor, but also considered that it is their God-given right to intervene into these environments. This was a radical change that laid the foundation for modern post-colonial planning and the eventual legitimization of slum clearance, which the municipal authorities began immediately in the 1920s. This was the predecessor to the evictions that are carried out in order to make way for present-day beautification projects.
So this is exactly why I said it's an importation of a problem. This problem did not exist as the Colombo expanded and so on. People may have existed, the densities may have existed, but the problem didn't exist. They were assuming that due to densities, the problems their own cities had might show up here. So now the densities are, they're using indicators to measure this. I mean, they imported the urban problems via the ordinance. Now the ordinance says this is a problem. I think Patrick Geddes was successful. The role Geddes played was to colonize Ceylon, instead of understanding it and Colombo and responding to it.
But Sir Patrick's complete vision of Colombo as a garden city would never flourish. Despite their colonization, the Ceylonese who moved into British areas did not fully share the same values. Due to economic, political, and cultural factors, the garden city image of Colombo increasingly declined over the succeeding decades. The best example for this can be witnessed in the city's waning tree linings. While Colombo 7 and Colombo 5 have the highest tree cover, the more you move away from these areas, the less likely you are to see streets lined with trees. The trees that were planted during the colonial period, exotic or native to Sri Lanka, are slowly disappearing. With this, Colombo's status as a garden city is likely to be lost to time.